There are cattle grazing on the bottom of Medina Lake, not near the lake, not along the shore. On the lake bottom itself, the cracked, bleached, formerly submerged lake bed that, in a different hydrological era, sat beneath 86 feet of water. The cattle are there because the grass has returned to soil that has not seen sunlight in decades. And because the ranch fences that once marked the boundary between land and lake are now the same fence that marks the boundary between land and more land. The water that belonged between those two things is largely gone. The aerial photographs of Medina Lake, taken in the past few years, document this with an immediacy that hydrological data cannot match. Where the reservoir used to spread across more than 6,000 acres of the hill country landscape, what remains is a small, dark pool in the deepest canyon sections, ringed by the bleached sediment of a lake bed that decades of normal water levels never exposed. Medina Lake sits in the Texas Hill Country, roughly 40 miles northwest of San Antonio, in the cedar-covered limestone country where the Medina River threads through Bandera and Medina counties on its way toward the San Antonio River and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. At full pool, the lake holds just over 254,000 acre-feet of water behind a concrete gravity dam that, when it was completed in 1913, was the largest dam in Texas and the fourth largest in the United States. At full pool, the lake's surface area extends across more than 6,000 acres of the hill country landscape, making it one of the most significant recreational and water storage assets in the region. Boaters come from San Antonio. Fishing guides run their operations on the deeper channels. The resort communities and vacation cabins along the shoreline are full through the summer season. Agricultural water users in the Medina and Atascosa valleys downstream depend on releases from the reservoir to irrigate crops that have been grown there since before World War I. In early 2026, the gauge reads 4.3% of capacity, not 4.3% below average, 4.3% total. The lake holds approximately 11,000 acre-feet of water in the deepest pockets of its basin, in the canyon sections where the terrain is too narrow for cattle to find much use in the dried sediment. The remaining 243,000 acre-feet of Medina Lake's designed storage capacity is absent. The water that should be there is not. Dave Mock, the general manager of the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District, one of the agencies that manages the lake system and monitors its condition, has the sentence that describes the situation with the most precision. He has been saying it to journalists, to water authority meetings, to anyone who asks what is happening to Medina Lake. It's just been so dry for so long. 7 words. No technical vocabulary, no hedging. Just the directness of someone who has watched a large body of water disappear, year by year, below the minimum threshold at which it can function as the water source it was built to be. In April 2025, Medina Lake stopped delivering water downstream entirely. The engineers call this state dead pool, when the lake's elevation falls below the point at which gravity can push water through the outlet structures and into the downstream channels that serve agricultural users, municipal customers, and the river itself. The lake was at 2.1% of capacity when it reached that point. Downstream flow stopped completely. The Medina River below the dam, which is supposed to carry the water that the reservoir releases to the farms and communities that depend on it, ran dry. It recovered slightly over the summer of 2025, when the same hill country flood events that killed people in Kerr County in July sent runoff into the lake's drainage basin and pushed the level briefly to around 6.5%. Then it began declining again. By February 2026, it is back at 4.3% and falling. The Bandera County River Authority has issued Stage 4 water restrictions, the most severe category in its emergency protocol. The Bexar Medina Atascosa Water Control and Improvement District, which operates the reservoir itself, is under the same Stage 4 restrictions. The drought monitor classification for the area is exceptional, the most severe classification on the U.S. Drought Monitor's 5-level scale. The trajectory is not reassuring. The brief recovery from the July 2025 flooding was the kind of relief that weather events occasionally provide to a crisis without resolving it. The underlying dryness that produced the multi-year decline is still present. The aquifer that sits beneath the surrounding hill country, which is supposed to provide backup water supply when surface water is insufficient, is also under strain from increasing population in the region and from the same precipitation deficit that is starving the lake. 3 threads run through what follows: how Medina Lake works, and why a reservoir at 4% capacity is not simply a full reservoir running at reduced output. The specific mechanisms, geological, atmospheric, and human, that have produced one of the most severe water emergencies the Texas Hill Country has experienced in the modern era. And the stakes for the farms that have depended on this water since before World War I. For the communities whose wells and municipal supplies are connected to the same system the reservoir anchors. And for a region that is growing in population at exactly the moment when its water supply is most severely stressed. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. The gauge is still falling. Let's begin. Medina Lake did not appear on its own. It was built, deliberately and expensively, to solve a problem that the natural hydrology of the Texas Hill Country creates for anyone trying to grow food there. The Medina River flows out of the Edwards Plateau, the limestone upland that forms the geographic core of the Texas Hill Country, and descends into the valley system southwest of San Antonio. The river is not a stable, reliable stream. It is highly variable, subject to the same pattern of extended dry periods and sudden intense rainfall events that characterize the entire hill country. The Edwards Plateau limestone is extraordinarily porous, meaning that rainfall often disappears into the rock before it can accumulate in streams. The pores and fractures and caves of the karst terrain are not passive. They actively capture rainwater and route it into the subsurface aquifer system, sometimes at rates fast enough to be visible, as rain falls onto dry limestone and vanishes before it can flow anywhere. The streams that do form can flood catastrophically during significant rain events, when the limestone's absorption capacity is overwhelmed and runoff races across the surface, and run nearly dry between those events when the limestone is pulling the remaining moisture underground. For agricultural purposes, a river this variable is difficult to depend on without some mechanism for capturing and storing the water when it comes, and releasing it when crops need it. Medina Dam was the mechanism. Construction started in November 1911 and was completed in 1913, a project undertaken by the Medina Valley Irrigation Company, the predecessor to the Bexar Medina Atascosa Water Control and Improvement District that operates it today. The dam is a gravity concrete structure, 1,580 feet long, 164 feet tall at its maximum, designed to impound the Medina River behind a mass of reinforced concrete sufficient to hold back the full weight of the water above it through the force of gravity alone. A gravity dam does not rely on arch geometry or soil anchoring for its structural integrity, It relies on being so massive, so heavy, so physically substantial that the water pressing against its upstream face cannot move it. Medina Dam qualifies on all counts. When it was finished, it was the largest dam in Texas and the fourth largest in the United States. It created, in the valley above it, a reservoir large enough to irrigate tens of thousands of acres of agricultural land in the Medina and Atascosa valleys downstream. The irrigation district created to use the dam's water was ambitious in scale. The Ma district developed canal infrastructure running for miles through the Medina and Atascosa valleys, designed to distribute water from the reservoir to the farms that grow cotton, grain sorghum, and other crops in terrain that receives too little and too variable rainfall to sustain rain-fed agriculture reliably. The system built around Medina Lake is not simply a reservoir with a pipe to the fields. It is an engineered cascade, a precisely sequenced set of structures that work together under gravity to move stored water from the reservoir to the point of agricultural use. Water held in Medina Lake is released under gravity through the outlet works in the dam and downstream through the Medina River channel to the Medina Diversion Dam, a second structure about 4 miles below Medina Dam. The diversion dam's function is specific, to intercept the water flowing downstream from the reservoir and divert it into the canal network. The canals run from the diversion dam through the agricultural lands of the Bama district, distributing the water to the farm fields that the entire infrastructure was built to serve. This cascade structure is why a reservoir at 4% of capacity is not the same as the full system operating at 4% efficiency. The cascade depends on gravity. It depends on pressure. It depends on the water in the reservoir being at a sufficient elevation to move, under the force of its own weight, through the outlet structures in the dam and down through the downstream channel to the diversion point and the canals beyond. When the reservoir is at high elevation, the hydraulic gradient is strong, and the system moves water efficiently and reliably. As the elevation drops, the gradient weakens. Below a certain threshold, the gravity-driven flow ceases entirely. That threshold has a name. It is called dead pool. Dead pool for Medina Lake at the engineering level is defined by the elevation at which the reservoir's outlet structures can no longer access the remaining stored water, approximately 912 feet above mean sea level, based on the elevation of the dam's lowest intake points. Below that elevation, the water in the lake is physically unreachable through the dam's normal operational infrastructure. It sits in the deepest pockets of the reservoir basin, beyond the reach of the gravity system, physically present but operationally inaccessible. A reservoir at dead pool still contains water. That water simply cannot be used. But Medina Lake's operational crisis arrived well above the engineering dead pool. When the lake dropped to approximately 970 feet of elevation in April 2025, still nearly 60 feet above the absolute engineering dead pool, downstream flow had already ceased completely. The operational dead pool. The level at which the gravity cascade to downstream users stops functioning arrived earlier than the engineering dead pool, because the system requires not just that water be present in the lake, but that the water be at sufficient elevation and volume to generate the hydraulic pressure needed to sustain flow through the channel downstream to the diversion dam and into the canal system. A thin film of water at insufficient elevation produces insufficient pressure. The flow stops. Think of it like the last few ounces of water in a jug that is nearly empty. Tipping the jug to pour gets harder. The water that does emerge gets slower and harder to control. Below a certain angle, nothing comes out even though water is still visible inside. The jug is not empty. It is operationally empty for the purpose of pouring. Medina Lake at 970 feet of elevation was, in April 2025, operationally empty for the purpose of supplying downstream users, not because the water was gone, but because the physics of the system could no longer deliver what remained. The distinction between engineering dead pool and operational dead pool matters for understanding the specific danger at 4% of capacity in early 2026. The lake is above the absolute minimum. It is above the level at which extraction through the dam becomes physically impossible. But it is not far above the operational threshold at which delivery to downstream users stops. The gap between the current level and the dead pool threshold, both engineering and operational, is measured in feet and weeks, not in the comfortable margins that a well-managed reservoir normally maintains as its buffer against the next dry period. The outlet works at Medina Dam, the gates and pipes and channels through which water is released into the downstream system, were designed for a reservoir that would typically hold tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of acre-feet. They were not designed for the precision management required when the total storage is measured in the low thousands. Operating a large dam with a nearly empty reservoir creates engineering challenges that the original designers did not anticipate. Because the original designers did not anticipate the reservoir routinely approaching empty. This is the specific engineering and operational context in which Dave Mock and the Bexar Medina Atascosa Water Control and Improvement District are managing the system in early 2026. Not a comfortable, reduced supply situation, an operational near-threshold condition, where the margin between functional delivery and zero delivery is measured in feet of elevation and days of dry weather. To understand the specific history that produced this crisis, and why it is not simply a bad drought year that will pass, you have to go back to what the reservoir was designed to do and the agricultural economy that was built on the assumption it would do it reliably. Medina Lake serves multiple categories of stakeholders, and the specific way each category is affected by the crisis tells the full story of what a water emergency at 4% of capacity actually means at ground level. The agricultural users of the Bima Irrigation District were the original reason the dam was built. The district was created specifically to deliver water from Medina Lake to the agricultural lands downstream. The farms in the Medina and Atascosa valleys that were established specifically because the dam made them possible. The Bima system serves irrigated agricultural land measured in tens of thousands of acres, land whose productivity and economic existence depend entirely on water releases from the lake. Cotton, grain, sorghum, and other crops in the Medina and Atascosa valleys exist because of Medina Dam. The farms that grow them were established between 1913 and the mid-20th century by families who invested in land and equipment on the promise of a reliable water supply that the dam would provide. Multiple generations of farming families have built their entire agricultural economies around water rights in the Ma system that entitle them to specific allocations of water from Medina Lake. When the lake cannot deliver water, those families have limited alternatives. Some operators have groundwater wells that can provide partial supplemental supply. But the groundwater beneath the Medina and Atascosa valleys is itself under pressure from the same precipitation deficit that is depleting the lake, and the groundwater system is not an independent alternative supply. It is a backup that is becoming less reliable as the conditions driving the surface water shortage also reduce aquifer recharge. Medina Lake has been low before. The Texas Hill Country experiences cyclical drought, a pattern that the historical record documents across a long enough period to establish that variability is the normal condition. In 2014, Medina Lake dropped to approximately 2.4% of capacity, the previous minimum conservation storage record before the current crisis. That 2014 low was alarming at the time. It eventually passed. The lake refilled to more functional levels, the crisis receded, and the agricultural operations in the Ma district resumed normal irrigation deliveries. The current crisis is different from 20 and 14 in one specific and important way. The 2014 event was a single cycle low. The lake dropped to its minimum, then recovered when wet years followed. The current situation involves a trajectory of repeated insufficient recovery. The lake dropped dramatically through 2022 and 2023. It recovered partially during wet periods, but each recovery has been less complete than the one before it. The 2025 July floods provided brief relief to approximately 6.5%, less than half of what a meaningful recovery would require to restore the system to comfortable operating levels. By the time that modest peak had been drawn down by evaporation and consumption through the fall of 2025, the lake was declining again and entered 2026 at levels that prompted the Stage 4 restriction declarations. The multi-year pattern of declining recovery peaks is the specific feature that distinguishes this from a single severe drought cycle and raises the question of whether a structural, long-term reduction in the water available to the Medina Lake system is underway. Not a bad year, a bad era. The tree rings of the Hill Country, which provide a proxy record of past drought and moisture conditions extending back centuries, document that the region has experienced multi-decadal drought periods in the past, periods of sustained aridity that lasted longer than any historical monitoring record, and that produced conditions outside the range of 20th century experience. The current era's precipitation deficits are occurring in a climate that is warmer than any of those historical dry periods, which means the evaporative demand placed on the water that does fall is higher, and the effective moisture available to feed the watershed is lower than the raw precipitation numbers alone would suggest. The combination of dry years and warm years operating simultaneously over an extended period is the specific compound that has produced the sustained decline the monitoring data shows. The specific history of the current crisis within this longer pattern follows a trajectory that the annual monitoring data documents with precise, uncomfortable clarity. In 2022, the lake was at 5% of capacity, and was already notable enough to appear in the Texas Water Development Board's monthly conditions report as one of the severely depleted reservoirs in the state. In 2023, cattle were grazing on the lake bed, a visual striking enough that the image circulated nationally in drought coverage and introduced the Medina Lake situation to audiences far beyond the Hill Country. In 2024, the decline continued below the 2022 and 2023 low points. By April 2025, the lake reached the operational dead pool threshold that Mock described, not the absolute engineering minimum, but the level at which downstream delivery stopped. By May 2025, the lake dropped further to 1.9%, the most severe reading in its recorded history. The July 4 floods provided temporary relief. The winter provided insufficient follow-through. By February 2026, the lake is at 4.3% and declining. The mechanism that produced this sustained decline is not simply insufficient annual rainfall. It is the specific interaction between the porous Edwards Plateau limestone geology, the warming temperatures that drive evapotranspiration across the watershed, and a precipitation pattern that has been running below the historical average that the lake's designers used to calculate its storage needs. The Edwards Plateau is karst terrain, limestone riddled with fractures, joints, solution caves, and the same dissolution channels that make the hill country springs famous and its water supply complicated. When rain falls on the plateau, a significant fraction of it disappears into the rock immediately, percolating down through the limestone to the aquifer below, rather than running off into streams. This natural subsurface routing is why the Edwards Aquifer exists. It is fed by rainfall on the recharge zone of the plateau, the strip of karst terrain that allows rain to enter the underground reservoir. But it also means that rainfall on the plateau does not automatically become stream flow in the Medina River. It means that below-average precipitation years produce below-average stream flow at rates that are amplified by the karst geology. A 20% precipitation deficit in a normal soil environment might produce a 25 or 30% streamflow deficit. In heavily karst terrain, the same 20% precipitation deficit can produce a 40 or 50% streamflow deficit, because the fractured limestone that roots water underground in wet conditions becomes even more effective at capturing the reduced rainfall in dry conditions, since the rock's moisture deficit draws in water that would otherwise run off. Temperature compounds this effect in two distinct ways. The first is direct evaporation from the lake surface itself. Medina Lake, already reduced to a small fraction of its normal surface area, approximately 6,000 acres at full pool, now a fraction of that, is losing water directly to the atmosphere through evaporation at a rate that meaningfully affects its storage trajectory. The Texas Hill Country summer brings sustained temperatures that accelerate evaporation from any exposed water surface. A lake at 4% of capacity is losing proportionally less water through evaporation than a full lake, because the surface area is smaller, but the loss is still significant relative to the remaining volume, and the remaining volume is so small that any loss drives the percentage materially downward. The second temperature effect is evapotranspiration from the watershed vegetation. Higher temperatures increase the water demand of every plant in the landscape: the grasses, the live oaks, the mountain laurels, and most controversially, the ash juniper, the cedar that covers vast acreages of the Edwards Plateau. Cedar has been the subject of sustained criticism from ranchers and water managers, who argue that its dense coverage, deep roots, and year-round transpiration consume water that would otherwise percolate to the aquifer or run off into streams. The scientific debate about cedar's specific hydrological impact is nuanced. Removing cedar does not produce simple or proportional increases in water yield in all circumstances. But the directional principle is sound. A landscape covered in water-transpiring vegetation, in the context of a prolonged drought, removes moisture from the soil at a rate that reduces both stream flow and aquifer recharge relative to a landscape with less vegetative cover. The cedar is not the cause of the crisis. It is one of the amplifying factors that makes the crisis more severe than the precipitation deficit alone would produce. The combined effect, below average precipitation, amplified by karst runoff ratios, amplified by evaporation from the lake surface, amplified by watershed evapotranspiration, is a reservoir that loses water faster and gains water more slowly than the precipitation record alone would suggest. When wet periods arrive, the ground that has been dry for months absorbs a portion of the rainfall before it can become runoff. When dry periods return, the soil moisture deficit that builds through the dry season means that the next rainfall event produces less stream flow than a comparable event would have produced in a wetter prior period. The reservoir operates in an environment that is structurally less favorable for storage than it was when the dam was designed, because the landscape and the atmosphere around it have both changed in ways that work against storage. This is the mechanism that the multi-year declining recovery trend reflects, not simply bad luck in the precipitation cycle. A structural shift in the hydrology of the Medina watershed that makes recovery harder and decline faster than prior decades would have suggested. Right now, in the early months of 2026, the monitoring picture at Medina Lake is one that the MA and the Bandera River Authority are watching on a daily basis, with a specific concern that the lake will return to dead pool before significant rain can reverse the trend. The lake sits at approximately 978 feet of elevation, about 86 feet below the full conservation pool crest of 1,064 feet. The gap between the current elevation and the operational dead pool threshold represents a volume of water that, at current rates of evaporation and consumption, is measured in weeks rather than months under current dry conditions. The downstream agricultural users who depend on releases from the reservoir have been receiving dramatically reduced or zero deliveries. The farming operations in the Medina and Atascosa valleys that were established a century ago on the premise of irrigated agriculture from Medina Lake are operating under conditions for which the system was not designed. The Drought Monitor tells its own story. Bandera County is classified under exceptional drought, the most severe category on the U.S. Drought Monitor's 5-tier scale, reserved for conditions where water shortages have created extreme hardship and economic impacts are widespread and severe. Exceptional drought in the Texas Hill Country means that soil moisture deficits extend to depths that preclude normal agricultural operations without irrigation, that the vegetation is stressed beyond seasonal norms, and that the groundwater recharge that normally replenishes aquifers during wet periods has been insufficient to overcome the accumulated drawdown from dry years. The Stage 4 water restrictions in effect across both the Bandera River Authority and the MA District represent the most restrictive tier in each agency's drought response protocol. Stage 4 typically limits irrigation to specific schedules and volumes, restricts non-essential water uses, and may require agricultural users to reduce their total water withdrawals below their full water rights allocation. Under Stage 4 restrictions, the water that does remain in the system is rationed in a managed hierarchy, municipal uses protected first. Agricultural uses accommodated within the remaining supply, recreational uses deprioritized entirely. The specific timeline of the current crisis is relevant to understanding how serious the 4% reading is. In April 2025, the lake reached dead pool at 2.1%. In May 2025, it dropped further to 1.9%, the most severe reading in its recorded history. The July 4th, 2025 flood events in Kerr County, which killed people in the Guadalupe River corridor to the north, and generated the largest regional emergency response in the Hill Country in decades, sent runoff into the Medina watershed that pushed the lake from its dead pool minimum back up toward 6.5% over the following weeks. That recovery was genuine and meaningful. It was also modest and temporary. By the fall of 2025, the lake had declined again from its July peak. By February 2026, it is at 4.3%, not as low as the April 2025 dead pool minimum, but following the same declining trajectory that produced the April 2025 minimum, starting from a baseline that is higher than the April 2025 starting point. Whether the February 2026 position leads to another dead pool event before the spring rainy season provides relief depends on the precipitation that arrives in the next several weeks. That precipitation has not yet arrived. The forecast does not provide confident reassurance that it will arrive soon enough. Medina Lake serves multiple categories of stakeholders, and the specific way each category is affected by the crisis tells the full story of what a water emergency at 4% of capacity actually means at ground level. The agricultural users of the Bima Irrigation District are the most directly exposed. The district was created specifically to deliver water from Medina Lake to the agricultural lands downstream, and the farms in those lowlands have been irrigating with Medina Lake water since before World War I. When the lake cannot deliver water, the farms have limited alternatives. Some operators have groundwater wells that can provide partial supplemental supply. But the groundwater beneath the Medina and Atascosa valleys is itself under pressure. The aquifer systems in this part of Texas are not isolated from the surface water system, and the same multi-year precipitation deficit that has drained Medina Lake has reduced the aquifer recharge that would normally be sustaining those wells. Mock noted in April 2025 that one of the surrounding aquifers was also under strain, with wells in the area drying up and recharge potential reaching record lows. The groundwater that is supposed to be the agricultural sector's backup to surface water scarcity is being compromised by the same drought that is depleting the surface water. The communities in Bandera County face a version of this problem that is less immediately catastrophic, but more structurally complicated. The town of Bandera, the county seat, has its own water infrastructure with some groundwater access. But the water supply situation in Bandera County is interlocked with the Medina River system in ways that make a prolonged surface water crisis a municipal water quality and availability issue as well. When the Medina River runs dry below the dam, as it does during dead pool conditions, the pools of standing water that form in the river channel become stagnant. The city of Bandera's own 2023 drought response included closing the city park and restricting swimming in the Medina River due to water quality degradation in the pools left behind when the river stopped flowing. A river that does not flow is not just a recreation inconvenience. It is an ecological and water quality deterioration that affects the broader water environment of the region. The most legally tangled part of the Medina Lake crisis involves the San Antonio water system, the utility that provides water to the San Antonio metropolitan area and its more than 2 million residents. SAWS holds a water supply contract with the Bima district, under which it is entitled to receive Medina Lake water as part of its regional supply portfolio when the lake has water to deliver. The contract also obligates SAWS to make payments to the district even in periods when no water can be delivered, when the lake is at dead pool and there is nothing to release. This creates a situation in which SAWS is paying for water that does not exist, and the Bama district is receiving payment for water it cannot provide. While both parties navigate the legal and financial complexities of a contract built for normal operating conditions that no longer exist. Reporting from the San Antonio Express News has described the financial and legal tangle that this arrangement creates, a legitimate contractual obligation generating increasingly absurd outcomes as the climate diverges from the conditions the contract assumed. The SAWS contract complication is not simply a billing dispute. It reflects the structural problem that runs through every aspect of the Medina Lake crisis. The legal, financial, and operational architecture of the water system was designed for a hydrological baseline that is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Water rights in Texas are legally defined entitlements, not merely administrative allocations. They were established by court adjudication and legislative action. They encode an expectation, not a guarantee, but an expectation, of a water supply that their original holders believed the natural system would provide. When the natural system stops providing that supply, the legal entitlements remain on paper while the physical water they describe evaporates from the monitoring gauge. The contracts are valid. The water they contemplate is not there. The Bexar Medina Atascosa Water Control and Improvement District is itself in a position of extraordinary operational difficulty. The district was created for one purpose: to deliver Medina Lake water to the agricultural lands it was built to serve. When the lake cannot deliver water, the district's entire operational purpose is suspended. It still has obligations to operate and maintain the dam and the canal infrastructure, to manage the legal and financial dimensions of the supply contracts, to administer the water rationing protocols that govern reduced supply periods. But its ability to fulfill its primary mission, delivering water to farms, is contingent on the lake having water to deliver. And the lake is not cooperating. The recreational and tourism economy of the Medina Lake area is the third major stakeholder category, and while it may seem secondary to agricultural and municipal concerns, it is central to the economic identity of Bandera County and the broader hill country. Bandera bills itself as the cowboy capital of the world and has long depended on tourism, Western heritage tourism, outdoor recreation, and proximity to San Antonio as a significant component of its economy. Medina Lake is a central recreational asset in that economy. Boaters, anglers, cabin renters, and resort guests generate economic activity that flows through the restaurants, shops, and service businesses of Bandera and surrounding communities. When Medina Lake is at 4%, the marina docks are on dry land. The recreation economy has been severely suppressed for multiple consecutive seasons as the lake has remained at levels insufficient for normal recreational use. Businesses built around lake access, boat rental operations, fishing guide services, lakeside resort accommodations have been operating at fractions of normal capacity for years. Some have closed. The population of the Texas Hill Country is growing. The communities of Kerrville, Fredericksburg, Bourne, Comfort, and the surrounding unincorporated areas have been among the fastest-growing small towns in Texas for the past decade, driven by the Hill Country's appeal as both a retirement destination and an exurban residential community for San Antonio workers. Vacation rental properties, resort developments, and residential subdivisions are being built in the Hill Country at a pace that increases the per capita water demand on a system that is already unable to meet existing demand under current conditions. New residents in the Hill Country bring water needs that must be met from the same groundwater and surface water systems that established agricultural and municipal users are already drawing down. Each new household with a well in the Hill Country is adding one more withdrawal point to an aquifer system that recharges slowly, depletion rapidly, and currently receives less precipitation than the long-term average that its sustainable yield calculations were based on. This is the population water intersection that water managers in the Hill Country are watching with the specific urgency of people who can see both sides of the equation moving in the wrong direction simultaneously. The demand curve is rising. The supply curve is falling. The reservoir that anchors the surface water system for the region is at 4% of capacity. The aquifer that is supposed to supplement the surface water is under increasing extraction pressure. The precipitation that would recharge both systems is running below historical averages with no reliable indication of when or whether a sustained wet period will arrive. The Texas Hill Country's water crisis is not isolated from larger patterns. It is one expression of the water stress that is affecting multiple regions of the American South and Southwest simultaneously, driven by a combination of structural aridification, growing population, and infrastructure designed for hydrological conditions that are becoming less reliable. The Edwards Aquifer is simultaneously the Hill Country's most important water resource and one of the most legally and politically contested water systems in the United States. The aquifer underlies roughly 3,600 square miles of south-central Texas and supplies water to approximately 2 million people in the San Antonio metropolitan area, plus substantial agricultural users across the region. The Edwards Aquifer Authority regulates pumping from the system under a framework shaped by decades of litigation, federal environmental law, and interstate water conflict. The 1993 Sierra Club v. Ling lawsuit, which became a landmark Endangered Species Act challenge to Edwards Aquifer pumping, established that minimum spring flows at Comal and San Marcos Springs, which are sustained by the aquifer, must be protected to maintain the habitat of endangered species that depend on them. The resulting regulatory framework imposes pumping limits that constrain how aggressively groundwater can be used as a substitute when surface water is insufficient. The limits exist for legitimate environmental reasons. They also mean that the emergency backstop of unconstrained groundwater pumping is not available to the region, even in a surface water crisis as severe as what Medina Lake is experiencing. The population of the Texas Hill Country is growing rapidly, and the collision between that growth and the declining water supply is not a future problem. It is the current context within which the Medina Lake crisis is unfolding. The communities of Kerrville, Fredericksburg, Bourne, Comfort, and the surrounding areas have been among the fastest-growing small towns in Texas for the past decade. The Hill Country's appeal as a retirement destination, a short-term vacation rental market, and an exurban residential community for San Antonio workers has driven residential development at a pace that is adding water demand to a system that cannot sustain existing demand. Each new residential development in the Hill Country draws from the same aquifer system that existing users depend on. Each new vacation rental property with a lawn to irrigate adds to the demand that the precipitation-constrained water system must serve. The demand curve is rising in a system where the supply curve is falling, and the gap between them is currently occupied by the declining level of a reservoir at 4% of capacity. The broader national context is one in which multiple river systems and reservoir networks are experiencing versions of the same structural mismatch that Medina Lake is expressing. The reservoirs of the Colorado River system, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, Lake Havasu, have experienced unprecedented low levels driven by a combination of overallocation and reduced snowpack. The Rio Grande, which feeds the larger water system just to the west of the Medina watershed, hit dead pool at Elephant Butte Reservoir at 2% of capacity. The same atmospheric warming that is increasing evapotranspiration in the Medina watershed is reducing snowpack in the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. These are not independent regional crises. They are expressions of the same continental scale change in the water balance of the American arid zone. Internationally, the scenario of a reservoir serving a drought-stressed agricultural economy reaching operational dead pool is a documented pattern across dryland environments. The reservoirs of northeastern Brazil's semi-arid Nordeste, historically one of the world's most drought-vulnerable agricultural regions, have reached dead pool and dropped to zero on multiple occasions. Most recently, in the severe drought of 2012-2016, when reservoirs that served millions of people ran completely dry, the Australian Murray-Darling Basin experienced a comparable restructuring of its water economy through the millennium drought of 1997-2009, when the river system's flows dropped to historical minimums, and the agricultural economy of the basin was forced through a painful process of water right reallocation and farm consolidation that is still incomplete. The Medina Lake crisis does not reach those scales. The reservoir is small, the population served is comparatively modest, and the institutional capacity to respond is more developed than in many of the international parallels. But the structure of the crisis is identical. A water storage system designed for historical hydrological variability encounters a sustained period of conditions outside that variability's range, and the assumptions embedded in the system's legal, financial, and operational architecture encounter reality. The Medina Dam was completed in 1913. The engineers who designed it had access to approximately 30 years of regional weather records. 30 years is enough to establish a working estimate of normal precipitation. It is not enough to capture a millennium of hill country climate variability, and it is not enough to project the warming-driven aridification trend that would begin altering the watershed's hydrology over the course of the following century. They built what the records told them to build. The records did not yet contain the story they were building against. The dam that emerged from their work was genuine engineering achievement, the largest in Texas at the time of its completion, designed to endure for generations, and to transform a drought-prone region into a productive agricultural zone that could support a stable agricultural economy. By most measures, it succeeded for most of its first century. It took an era of sustained, multi-year precipitation deficit, the kind of extended dry period that the early 20th century records did not capture, to expose the gap between what the dam was designed to manage and what the climate is now delivering. What the science of water resource monitoring can see about this situation is extensive and precise. The Texas Water Development Board publishes daily reservoir storage data for Medina Lake and more than 100 other monitored reservoirs across the state, available in near real time to anyone with an internet connection. A transparency that would have seemed impossible to the engineers who built Medina Dam in 1913 and managed it with telegrams and paper forms. The USGS operates stream gauge monitoring on the Medina River at the dam and at points upstream, tracking inflow to the reservoir continuously and building the flow record against which current conditions are compared. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center issues seasonal drought outlooks for the southern United States that characterize the probability of drought continuation or improvement over 3-month windows. The National Drought Monitor, updated weekly, classifies current conditions across every county in the country on its 5-tier scale and has classified Bandera County at exceptional, the most severe tier, for extended periods during the current crisis. The monitoring system that exists for Medina Lake in 2026 is immeasurably more sophisticated than anything available to the water managers who first operated the system a century ago. The data is there. The trend is visible. The crisis is documented in real time with precision that generates daily numbers accurate to a fraction of a percentage point. What this monitoring system cannot do is tell the Ma District or the Bandera River Authority or the farmers in the Medina Valley when the next significant rainfall will arrive, how large it will be, and whether it will be sufficient to reverse a trajectory that has been running persistently in one direction for years. The hill country precipitation pattern is driven by Gulf moisture, by the large-scale atmospheric circulation that determines whether and when moisture plumes reach the Edwards Plateau, and by precipitation variability on both the seasonal and multi-year timescales. The seasonal forecast can characterize the probability of above normal or below normal precipitation 3 to 6 months ahead. It cannot specify whether the specific storm that would provide meaningful lake recovery will occur before the lake's remaining storage is exhausted. That specificity is beyond the resolution of any forecast product currently available. This uncertainty, the gap between knowing the trajectory and knowing when or whether it turns, is the operational challenge that Mock and the Ma District and the downstream agricultural users are navigating in early 2026. They know where the lake is. They know what direction it is moving. They do not know the day the rain comes, or whether it will come at sufficient scale to matter before the gauge reaches the operational dead pool threshold it crossed twice in 2025. The lake in early 2026 is at 4%. The same gauge that showed 2.5% in April 2025 when dead pool first arrived, 1.9% in May 2025 when it hit its lowest measured level, and 6.5% in the brief period after the July 2025 floods now shows 4.3% and declining. The monitoring data does not offer a recovery trajectory. It offers a current reading and a trend. In April 2025, the lake was at 2% and delivering nothing downstream. The summer of 2025 provided brief partial recovery. The winter of 2025-2026 provided insufficient follow-through. The gauge is showing a level that, if it continues declining at current rates under current evaporation and consumption conditions, will return the lake to dead pool before the next significant precipitation event can reverse the trajectory. Dave Mock has been saying the same thing since the crisis began its most severe phase. He does not promise that the lake will recover. He does not predict that it will reach zero. He describes what the monitoring data describes. It has been so dry for so long, and the trajectory is where it is, and the work of the water managers in his position is to manage what can be managed: the Stage 4 restrictions, the reduced agricultural allocations, the emergency protocols, and to wait for the weather that cannot be managed to provide the precipitation the system requires. The cattle on the lakebed have access to water from other sources. They are cattle. They can be moved to different pasture. They can be watered from tanks and wells. The farms that have irrigated from Medina Lake water for more than a century are less mobile. The alfalfa fields and cotton rows and grain sorghum plantings of the Medina and Atascosa valleys were established on the premise of a specific water allocation. Under water rights that are legally valid and agriculturally essential, from a reservoir that is at 4% of the capacity it was designed to maintain. The legal contracts that entitle users to water from the system predate the current crisis by decades in some cases, and by a century in others. They were written for a lake that was expected to hold 250,000 acre-feet, not 11,000. The dam is still there. The concrete gravity structure that was the largest dam in Texas when it was completed in 1913 still stands across the Medina River Gorge, 164 feet tall, 1,580 feet long, structurally sound by every engineering assessment. The outlet structures are still functional. The Medina Diversion Dam 4 miles downstream is still operational. The canal network that would distribute water to the downstream farms if the lake had water to release is still present in the landscape. The same canals that have been moving Medina Lake water to agricultural fields since before World War I. The water is not. At 4%, Medina Lake holds roughly 11,000 acre-feet of water in the deepest pockets of its basin. It does not hold enough to supply the agricultural system it was built to sustain through a dry summer. It does not hold enough to provide meaningful downstream flow to the Medina River. It holds enough, in the language of the monitoring gauge, to put a number on a crisis that is still technically above zero while being functionally below anything the engineers who built the dam in 1913 planned for. They built it in a period of relatively generous precipitation, with records that were too short to capture the full range of the hill country's natural variability, and with no ability to anticipate the warming trend that would alter the watershed's hydrology over the following century. They built the largest dam in Texas, and they built it for a water supply that the climate was about to make less reliable than the historical record suggested. The gauge reads 4%. The cattle are on the lake bed. The ranchers and the farmers and the water managers and the downstream agricultural families and the legal holders of water rights from a reservoir at 4% of capacity are watching the same gauge. The sky above the hill country offers no particular reassurance. And the dam stands, waiting for the rain that the engineers of 1913 assumed would always come.